let me introduce Hancheng first. So Hancheng graduated from Stanford CS department with a minor in management science and engineering. And he's now a postdoc researcher at Microsoft Office of Applied Research. He'll join the Emory University, the business school at Emory University next year. So Hancheng today will talk about his pioneering work in evaluating and designing the computer system for the future, and also how can we use the large language models to facilitate the peer review process. And the whole talk should be about 1 hour. And in between the papers, we'll pause and wait for your questions. And if you have questions, you can just raise your hand or unmute yourself. And the floor is yours, Hancheng.
Great. Thanks so much for the kind introduction, and thanks so much for inviting me here to give this talk. Yeah, I think a little bit about what would be the best topics to give with this particular audience, and I actually have a number of conversations with Robin during this process, and eventually I decided to give this overview of 3 papers that I did during my PhD, since I think this type of work, they're previously, I was more in computer science and human-computer interaction community, but I think these topics could be potentially of interest to social scientists as well. So rather than just focusing on one single paper, I think it would perhaps be very interesting and exciting to hear about and encourage some kind of discussions on how people think about work in general in this direction. And I would hope that this presentation would encourage also some, like more conversations between social scientists and computer scientists. So yeah, that's kind of the thing that I would like to talk about first. And then I would like to dive into our specific projects. So today's topic is computing systems for the future of work. And before I dive into specific topics, I'd like to start with the following question. What computing technology would improve human collaboration and decision-making? Well, let's talk a bit about history. In fact, 120 years ago, people started to think about this particular question. Arthur Mee, an English writer, writes the following in 1898. If, as it is said to be not unlikely in the near future, the principle of sight is applied to the telephone as well as that of sound, Earth will be in truth a paradise, and distance will lose its enchantment by being abolished altogether. As you might have guessed out, he's talking about some type of working technology that's similar to what we know as room. So 120 years later, we indeed have a number of workplace technologies. We have Zooms and we have Microsoft Teams. We also have instant messaging applications like Slack to help us getting connected at workplace. And beyond that, we also have sophisticated hardware like AR and VR. And we are increasingly relying a lot on ChatGPT and other types of generative AI tools to help us with our work. So given all these advances in computing technologies in the workplace setting, the thing that I've been really curious about is, have we developed the ideal workplace technologies? Are we living in a paradise as suggested by Arthur Mee 120 years ago? The landscape is really unclear and vague. In fact, there have been mixed views on current workplace technologies. So it is relatively hard for us to decide whether our Arthur Mee's vision has been achieved or not. So on one hand, there have been lots of positive sentiments. For example, in New York Times, there has been people talking about distance matters much less now, that computing technologies has been quite a success. And there have been lots of conversations and discussions in public news outlets. For example, this one is from Business Insider having the following title, "Why is Zoom suddenly everywhere? It's easy and fun to use." In comparison, on the other side, there's also negative sentiments. And in another article from New York Times has the following title, "Why Zoom is Terrible." And I would like to point out that based on the usefulness of computing technology, they're actually not unique to workplace scenario, but they also apply to many other domains as well. For example, education, relationship, and health, where we have seen lots of people, both in public outlets as well as in academics, discussing and debating whether technology has been helping or hurting their particular application. So the thing that I've been really curious about is how do we navigate such disagreements and make progress on these technologies? One thing that motivated me a lot is from this particular book written by Simon. And this particular book, written by Herbert Simon back in 1969, is themed around how artificial phenomena ought to be categorized. And discussing here in this book is Simon discussed whether such phenomena belong within the domain of science. So as one of the pioneers of artificial intelligence as well as organization theory, Simon gives really this interesting view of thinking about technologies and especially artificial technology as a science rather than a technology itself. So in this book, Herbert Simon wrote, "Natural science is knowledge about natural objects and phenomena." We asked whether there cannot also be artificial science knowledge about artificial objects and phenomena. So in this book, it questions whether artificial objects could be studied in a way that would be similar as physics, chemistry, as well as other sorts of natural science. And in this particular work, he proposed 3 important factors that would contribute towards the science of the artificial, which is empirical evidence, technical methods, and design. In terms of empirical evidence, Simon wrote, "The contingency of artificial phenomena has always created doubts as to whether they fall properly within the compass of science. The genuine problem is to show how empirical propositions can be made at all about systems." And in terms of technical methods, Simon emphasized the importance of modeling and simulation as well as many other techniques. And finally, in terms of design, he pointed out it's important to study not only how things are, but also how things ought to be. And my research has been largely motivated by this vision. And I've been trying to tackle a number of questions with regard to this particular vision and trying to bridge in insights from both computer science as well as social science. For example, on the empirical evidence side, I've been very interested in things with regard to how can we leverage increasingly available large-scale data to study machine behavior and human behavior over computing platforms. And in terms of technical methods, I'm interested in asking and answering things like, how can we better model, sense, and predict machine behavior and human behavior? And finally, in terms of design, I'm interested in things like, how can we design applications that align with our needs and values with powerful computing technologies? And with that, I've been conducting quite a number of cross-disciplinary collaborations, working together with both computer scientists as well as social scientists, and collaborated with big tech companies like Microsoft and Asana, as well as smaller companies like Gixter. And for today, I would like to focus on discussing my work in the workplace technology settings, although I have also investigated other things on other sides. And specifically, there are 3 things that I would like to discuss that would contribute towards a better understanding and towards what I would call a science of workplace technologies here. And I would like to use this framework from Simon to structuralize my particular presentation. And in terms of empirical evidence, I would like to first talk about a study that I've been done some years ago during the COVID pandemic period, where we have been looking at how people have been engaging in remote meetings and how people have been multitasking during remote meetings, working on other tasks, which are closely relevant to one's productivity and well-being. And in terms of technical methods, I'd like to talk about our work where we have been using AI to analyze communication data between team members on the computing platforms and using that to help predict the team well-being or team satisfaction. And finally, in terms of design, I'd like to talk about another work where we have been leveraging large language model to provide feedback to researchers, which could be considered as the specific form of work that is super important to this particular type of knowledge workers, we researchers. And with that, I'd like to dive into the first work of the day. So this particular work is conducted in collaboration with Microsoft back in 2020. And this particular work is motivated by something that we have been experiencing a lot during the pandemic and even today, where people have been having lots of remote meetings. And people have been feeling that they haven't been really engaging enough and feeling productive during the meetings. Back then, there has been this particular term of Zoom fatigue, and people have been discussing a lot about factors that would contribute to productive and engaging meetings. So our goal in this particular work is try to get a systematic understanding through measurement of remote meeting multitasking behavior. I do not really need to spend much time on this slide since remote meeting has been so ubiquitous. Remote work, as shown by quite some work, has been a central mode of work across industries. And central to remote works and remote meetings through video conferencing tools like Zoom, like what we are doing today, which help remote team members stay connected, collaborate, and function as an organization despite physical distance. And multitasking behavior is one specific behavior that people have been studying, especially in psychology. Multitasking behavior refers to performing more than one task in parallel or in rapid succession. And prior work has shown multitasking is closely linked to one's productivity and well-being. Multitasking, from a meeting standpoint, is also an important experience. Since people have been doing that a lot, we all have this experience of during remote meetings, doing something else like checking emails or getting other work done in this particular process. So far, there hasn't been a systematic understanding when, how, and why people engage in multitasking behavior under remote meetings. And especially prior works on multitasking over computing platforms, they're generally pretty limited in coverage, focusing just a few number of people, usually through a lab-based experiment. And what we want to contribute in this study is try to get a larger scale evidence on this multitasking behavior during remote meetings through mixed methods. And here are a number of things that we seek to address in this particular work. First of all, how much multitasking is happening during remote meetings? Secondly, what factors associated with multitasking during remote meetings? Thirdly, what do people do when multitasking during remote meetings? And finally, what are the consequences of multitasking during remote meetings? And here we adopt a mixed method approach. First, we have a large-scale analysis on telemetry datasets, where we use passively collected data and try to measure and reflect objective patterns at scale. On the other side, to complement this regression analysis, we also have a diary study using which we seek qualitative evidence, try to capture the nuanced experiences and motivations behind multitasking behavior. Let's talk about the first method, large-scale telemetry data sets analysis. For this particular data sets, we are leveraging some resources from Microsoft. We collected meeting-related actions from Microsoft Teams. We collect email usage data from Microsoft Outlook, as well as file edits data from SharePoint and OneDrive. And we collected in total 4 separate week-long snapshots from February to May 2020 of all Microsoft employees in US. And through these data sets, we first derive a number of characteristics of the meetings, including meeting durations, meeting size, meeting types, hour of the day of the week. And then we join the different data sources by unique user identifier, which in our case is Microsoft user ID. And for each meeting user pair, we label it as email multitasking if the user was found to have at least one active email action during the meeting. Otherwise, we assign a non-multitasking label. And similarly, we labeled file multitasking. Then we ran a conditional logistic regression to understand the relationship between multitasking and meeting characteristics. And just to know, like all the results that are reported here, they are correlational rather than causal, because we cannot really do experiments, and there's not exogenous shock in this particular period. But to complement this particular study, try to understand the mechanisms, we complement that with the diary study, which I will cover now. So for the diary study, we provided this particular question. What have you noticed about multitasking in your recent online meetings, with a list of subprompts? And we ran this diary study between mid-April and mid-August 2020, which is around a similar period where we collect the telemetry data. And in total here, we collected over 800 responses. So here are the major findings from this particular work. First, we find from February to May, around 30% of meetings involve email multitasking, and around 25% of meetings involve file multitasking. And we hear from people, more multitasking may be a possible result of work rhythm adaptation, and ease of turning off video and audio may encourage more multitasking. And secondly, which is the central piece of this particular work, we find a number of intrinsic meeting characteristics that are associated with multitasking. We find more multitasking happening in large, long, morning, and recurring meetings, as well as meetings with lower relevance or engagement. And more specifically, we find that the odds of email multitasking in meetings with over 10 attendees are 2.16 times the odds of the meetings with only 2 attendees. We also find people are more likely to multitask in longer meetings, that the odds of email multitasking in meetings longer than 80 minutes are 6.21 times the odds of 0 to 20 minutes meetings. I just presented 2 things that are relatively straightforward to understand, but I think what is really cool about this measurement study is that we also find a number of factors that are less obvious. For example, we find that people are more likely to multitask in morning meetings, that the odds of email multitasking in morning meetings are 1.86 times the odds of after-hour baseline, which is, work hours that is outside normal work hours. And we get some kind of qualitative evidence to support this particular observation, where someone has been saying, I'll try to glimpse at email more if a meeting is the first thing I do for work in the morning. So that type of multitasking is schedule related. We also find people are more likely to multitask in recurring meetings, that the odds of email multitasking in recurring meetings are 1.59 times the odds of one-off meetings. And here's some evidence from the qualitative response, where one participant mentions, just came off an online call with my larger design sync. It's a 30-minute recurring meetings where we share topics as our design team say in 2 cities. I didn't need to present, I was a listener, so I found myself responding to team messages, emails as the call was going on. So clearly, despite the meeting has been scheduled out there, and this is something that has been regularly held, it doesn't really apply that much to the participant, making that person multitasking. So given all of this, the thing that we should really rethink is, could a recurring meeting be an email instead? Aside from that, we also find a number of extrinsic meeting characteristics that are associated with multitasking. People multitask during meetings to catch up on other works due to external distractions such as software notification sound, and sometimes people multitask for anxiety relief. And in terms of what do people do when multitasking, it includes both work-related actions, such as emails and file edits, which corresponds to what we are doing in the telemetry analysis. And of course, there are a number of non-work related actions that are hard to capture by the telemetry data, including checking non-Microsoft social media and doing household chores. And finally, in terms of the consequence of multitasking, there are both positive sides and negative sides. But people have been mentioned on the positive sides that multitasking help boost productivity, whereas on the negative sides, which is in line with previous work, we find that people, they talk about multitasking could lead to loss of attention and engagement, lead to fatigue, and it could create a sense of disrespect in the particular collaboration experience. So given all of this particular work, we provide through measurement study, large-scale empirical evidence of multitasking behavior and task switching over multiple computing platforms. And we discussed a number of best practice guidelines for remote meetings, which actually has been used in some other scenarios by practitioners. So from our analysis, we find that to encourage productive meeting, perhaps it is advisable to avoid important meetings in the morning, reduce the number of unnecessary meetings, shorten meeting durations and insert breaks, encourage active contribution, and allow space for positive multitasking. In our paper, from a computer science perspective and from a design perspective, we also discuss a number of designs that could potentially make this multitasking experience better, including supporting focus mode for remote meetings and helping people to decide which meetings or which part of the meetings to attend to. And after the publication of this particular work, we get some kind of impacts. Well, our work has been discussed by a number of outlets in the news. But perhaps more encouraging is that our particular work has actually been used, especially our best work practices. It has been used by practitioners in different types of outlets, including computing platforms like Slack. But people have been actually using that in HR trainings and try to get helping them to understand how to make remote meetings work better. And finally, through this particular work, our design implication also has been translated into a product feature at Microsoft to measure the effectiveness of collaboration and effectiveness of remote work. So that would wrap up my first work, which is a pretty brief introduction, but I hope this particular work could give you an idea how we could leverage digital traces from computing platforms and using that to rethink about how we design computing platforms. Should I move on or answer any questions right now?
Yeah, maybe we'll pause here and to see whether people have questions about your first paper.
Okay.
So yeah, feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah. We could also leave higher level questions to the later half, because I think the three works that they are interconnected, but
Okay.
feel free to ask any clarification questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Cao. Actually, I have a question. How do you differentiate between productive and unproductive multitasking in your research?
Yes, that's a great point. We didn't really distinguish that in the telemetry analysis part, because we do not really have any ground truth label where people are saying whether this is positive multitasking, productive meeting or not. So those parts, we conducted that in the DARI study part, where since it is qualitative response, we do have people give responses on whether those experiences, they feel they are positive or not. So from the telemetry data analysis side, it's more on the analysis of the different factors that are related to this multitasking behavior. And the multitasking behavior itself could be positive or negative.
Okay, I see. So how do you integrate the empirical part with the telemetry data and your questionnaire study? How do you integrate these two parts?
Yes, that's a great point. So first of all, as I briefly discussed in my talk, so these two parts, they are both conducted at the same organization at Microsoft. So in fact, for the telemetry data analysis, the employees that we analyze, they are all US Microsoft employee. And the DARI study we run is a subset of them who are also working at Microsoft. So that creates kind of like the same ground for this type of study. And aside from that, we ran this kind of telemetry data analysis on one hand, and we conducted a number of analysis out there and understanding a number of characteristics that are related to multitasking. And on the direct study part, the objective, they are also similar in the sense of trying to understand what are some of the factors that would lead to people multitask. So we specifically asked that in the survey in the direct study part as well. And given that the objective, they are similar, so we summarized key themes together from the both studies.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Hancheng. I have a question. So do your results differs in, for example, people with different personal characteristics such as gender, geographic locations, and their positions in the company?
Yes, that's a great point and very interesting point. Yes, we do find that there is quite some differences across different demographics. And the specific things that we see, and I think we discussed a little bit in the paper, is that I think the ethnicity of the people out there is playing a role, and also the gender. And this is especially salient in scenarios where, since non-white people or like non-Indian, non-Chinese, and non-male, they are generally underrepresented group in tech companies. And we find that multitasking actually helping them make it to convey the message clearer, because traditionally they're not the one who would like to speak up, and especially in an in-person setting. Usually they won't be someone to convey the specific message to people. But we find actually in this kind of multitasking study where those people, they actually benefit from multitasking in the sense that while in meetings or while in meetings, they could send an email, send message to people, and to be engaging in a particular conversations that they would usually not do if that's in an in-person setting. So that type of observation is very interesting in the sense that different demographics and different people, they are feeling different ways in this shift to remote work.
Yeah, in the interest of time, why don't we move on to the second paper?
Yes, sure. The second study I would like to talk about is using team communication data and to study team collaboration process. This work is also published at the HCI CS conference, and this particular work is also motivated by things that are pretty familiar to us. So in this particular work, the key motivating question is, we are curious about this team collaboration experience. And as many of you may have experienced it, many team collaboration, eventually we feel that it is a great success for all of the people involved. But on other situations, we feel like the team just breaks apart and we do not really want to work with the same group ever again. So that is some experience that I guess many of you have encountered. And the thing that brings me really excited and wonder is, can we try to understand some mechanisms behind, and can we come up with some sorts of automatic way to classify and even predict this notion of team viability? The key concept here is team viability, also a widely studied psychology concept. It refers to team capacity for future success. It captures the team's interest in continuing to work together and reflects team members' satisfaction towards each other. And prior work has shown that low team viability would lead to team fall apart. So this particular work specifically focused on this particular dimension of team viability. And I would like to emphasize here that team viability is different from the traditional notion of team performance, in the sense that team performance is more about the objective objective activities people have been behaving and whether it turns out to be successful or not in an objective manner. But team viability is more from a subjective experience, whether people like the experience working together with the same group or not. And as it turns out, many high-performing teams, they have low viability. Even if people get things done, getting the project delivered in time, team members still suffer a lot from working together with each other. So basically, understanding team viability is a different way of trying to understand team collaboration. And it is arguably very important to understand things related to team churn, as well as employee leaving an organization. So in this current work, what we are conducting is a machine learning classification of high versus low viability teams. And here we focus mainly using team chat interactions. A number of research questions that we seek to address here. First of all, can we differentiate high versus low viability teams by analyzing team chat interactions? Secondly, we study what behavior traits are most strongly associated with high versus low viability teams. And certainly, we study how much time must the team interact before we can make accurate classifications of team viability, or in other words, can we predict team viability? This particular work, we first designed an experiment and collected some data sets. Here, we collect complete chat history of 669 newly convened online teams ranging from 3 to 8 people from Amazon Mechanical Turk who were collaborating on creative, intellectual, or cognitive conflict tasks over 10 minutes. And by the end of each team collaboration, we designed the surveys and asked all the team members to fill out. The team viability surveys include 14-item viability instrument on a 5-point Likert scale, which is proposed by some prior psychology researchers. And we summed each team member's 14 viability measures into a single individual score that ranges from 14 to 70 and calculate the mean of all of the individual score to determine a team viability score. And here's its distribution. And then our particular task is to classify high versus low viability teams. And to operationalize, we divide all teams into 2 groups, either high viability or low viability based on the viability score. And we set a cutoff viability score as a varying decision threshold. For example, we do things like classifying top 10% of teams by mean viability, or in other words, can we classify the most viable teams? We also do things like classify the top 50% of teams by mean viability, as well as classify top 90% of teams by mean viability, or in other words, can we classify the least viable teams? And it is essentially a binary classification model, and we tested multiple models, including straightforward explainable models, as well as more sophisticated neural models. But here, we are mostly focusing on the simplest model here, since it is explainable and it actually performs pretty well. So here is the number of features that we use for this particular analysis. We derive a number of interaction features, some computation derived and some human labeled from the interaction process. From the computation derived side, we derive features from the communication chats on work pattern features like message counts and turn taking. We also use natural language processing to derive a number of linguistic features, like how people choose particular words through loop categories and conduct sentiment analysis. To compare automatic features, we also collect a number of human label features so as to speak to the social science literature. For example, we get another group of MTurk workers manually read and coded the transcripts on dimensions like whether they think this particular team has experienced social loafings or frustration. So here are the main findings from this particular work. First, we find team viability, it can be classified with high accuracy. In fact, we find that classifying top 50% viable teams yield 0.76 AUC score, which is pretty good. Since for those of you who might not be super familiar with AUC, it's ranging from 0 to 1, and closer to 1 means that it is giving perfect prediction classification on all the outcomes. And in fact, one interesting thing is that we find that it is even easier and performing even better if we classify top 10% of viable teams, which is 0.93 AUC. And this observation is quite interesting. The fact that it's easier to classify the most viable teams suggests that the most viable teams, they may share very similar behavior patterns that have been captured by our feature extraction process. But those who breaks apart and doesn't perform that well, they might be breaking apart for different reasons. And another thing that I would like to note here that is quite interesting is on the right-hand figure. Here are 3 curves in different colors. They represent the classification result using different sets of features. Here, the blue curve demonstrates computational derived features classification results, and the orange curve demonstrates the human labeled features classification results. And the green curve demonstrates combining computational derived features and human labeled features together and making the classification. The x-axis represent different percentile viability split, or classifying different levels of a team viability. And the y-axis is the performance score. And as you can see here, the interesting thing is that computation-derived features actually performs the best, meaning that by relying on computational-derived features, we could make the best classification. It is better than using human-labeled features that are inspired by prior literature, and it is even better than combining 2 sets of things together. Which is actually interesting in the sense that it is indicating by using automatic features, it could actually provide the best performance. And arguably that would be very important to downstream applications if we want to use such type of methods for some real world applications. We could do that in an automatic way. In terms of the specific feature, we find that active response and engagement is an indicator of high viability teams. For example, use of exclusive language such as but, either, except, and addressing each other in second-person pronoun like you are significantly and positively correlated with higher viability. And here's an example of trying to understand why that might be the case. For example, here for exclusive language, these conversations includes a lot of things using exclusive language like but, either, and except. And as you can see here, the 3 people, they're really engaging in the conversation, and using exclusive language is an indicator of this engaging conversation. Finally, perhaps I think the most interesting and exciting part of this particular work is we find that classification of team viability is feasible after only 70 seconds of initial interactions. Out of the 10-minute interaction, we find with only first 12% or 70 seconds of the chat interaction, we achieve 95% of the performance accuracy from the full transcript when trying to differentiate the top 10% of teams. And similar patterns emerge for viability splits at different thresholds, which all indicates that there are perhaps enough viability signal embedded in the initial interactions within short time span. So in other words, if you want to make some classifications of, or even predictions of how the team is going, you do not really need a lot of data. You perhaps only need just a thin slicing of the data, and that could be enough. So just to sum up, for this particular work, we studied this notion of team viability and finding that it's driven by underlying mechanisms that are common across different team setups and task categories, and can be largely captured and explained by team member work and linguistic patterns, which could be extracted in an automatic way. And from a more computing system design perspective, such type of characteristics of being possible to predict ahead of time where the team is going, it could enable some downstream applications like early detection of low viability teams. And you could think about ways to provide some interventions or recommendations to improve team before they fall into trouble. And of course, this particular work that I presented is limited to online team working on short tasks, but we also have some other evidence that is ongoing that is showing it is working well for more realistic team like software engineers. And finally, we have a working prototype on our website where you could upload your transcripts of team interactions with team members and try to get a classification result whether your team is viable or not. And that would wrap up my second work, which I think would be a representative of using technical methods to study some social science problem.
Yeah, I wonder whether we can upload the transcript of this talk of Luohan Webinar to your Webability product. So
Yes,
why don't
that'll be
we
interesting.
why don't we go to the third paper?
Yes,
yeah.
sure. Yeah, I would go to the third paper due to the limitation of time. So the third paper is more on the design side. If you recall what Simon said, it's not only important to study how things are working, but it's also important to envision how things might work in the future. So in this particular work, we are specifically looking at this particular possibility of using generative AI to provide scientific feedback for researchers for this type of very specific type of knowledge workers. And in this particular work, we are motivated by this notion of scientific feedback. We all know like scientific feedback is super important since it improves research works by melding insights. It also lays the foundation of rigorous research. As scientific feedbacks, it will help improve the work and also make sure that the quality of the work is good. Traditionally, there have been multiple ways of doing scientific feedback, and arguably one of the most important ways is through peer review feedback, which we focus in this particular work. Despite the importance of scientific feedback, there has been a number of drawbacks with regard to the current systems, especially given that there have been increasing number of paper submissions in certain fields. And I guess in every field, we see that such type of phenomenon. For example, in computer science, the field that I'm most familiar with, some years ago, we are only seeing a few hundred submissions. In this iClear conference, for example, back in 2016, we only have a few hundred submissions, but back in 2023, we are seeing over 6,000 abstract submissions every year. And the direct consequence of increasing number of papers is that there have been overloaded reviewers. Many of us get assigned lots of paper to review, which is really hard because, due to the limitation of time, it's quite hard to get really high quality review back within a short turnaround time. And from the other side, there has been also increasing difficulties from the journal editor side or conference organizer side in securing qualified reviewers, where people over social media has been discussed a lot and complained a lot about this particular phenomenon. And from another perspective, it's also interesting in a sense that current feedback system is actually not friendly for under-resourced researchers. Under-resourced researchers, such as junior researchers or researchers from non-elite institutes or from resource-limited regions, they might have even harder times getting timely and quality feedback. For example, if they are in a journal field, their papers their paper gets rejected, perhaps they do not receive any feedback at all. So it's really hard, would be really hard for them to think about how to improve their paper. So the thing that we are very curious about here in this work is given the advance of large language model and all the evidence showing its great potential in many different settings, we are curious whether large language model could provide useful feedback on research papers. And from a design perspective, we proceed to build this particular tool and try to test it out. This particular tool is actually pretty straightforward. We first have authors upload their papers in PDF format. Then we have a parser on the back end parsing it into different sections. And then based on ChatGPT, based on GPT-4 specifically, we asked it to provide some kind of zero-shot response, providing some feedbacks to the paper in a similar way as what you would expect from actual peer review. And we built this tool, and the next steps is we want to understand to what extent it's helpful or not. And here we adopt a mixed methods analysis again. And specifically, we have two parts. We have a retrospective evaluation and a prospective user study and survey. In the retrospective evaluation, we compared what has been generated by GPT-4 versus what has been generated by human in the past. In the second study, we send out this particular tool to actual human researchers, asking them to upload their own papers from over 300 researchers, and asking them to assess whether GPT-4 feedbacks to their papers are useful or not. So let's talk about the first study. So in the retrospective evaluation, we first curated two large-scale data sets. We first get over 3,000 papers and 8,700 human reading reviews from Nature family journals, including the main journal of Nature, as well as a number of subjournals from Nature family, including Nature Biomedical Engineering, Nature Human Behavior, and many others. Another data set we use is from this computer science conference, ICLR, which is one of the most important conferences on machine learning and AI. Here we have over 1,700 papers, as well as over 6,500 human reading reviews sourcing from ICLR 2022 and 2023. We curated these two data sets to represent papers from different characteristics. So on one hand, the Nature Family Journal data sets, it covers a wide array of scientific fields and covers from niche to high impact journals, yet its limitations is that it contains only reviews for a number of accepted papers because the authors need to agree they want to review this particular review process before we can actually get those data. So that actually constitutes only about 40% of all accepted Nature family journals. And the second data set that we use from ICLR, despite the fact that it's only focusing on one single field, since it is held over this particular platform called Open Review, it contains reviews of both accepted and rejected papers. So basically, if you submit to this particular conference, whether you're rejected or not, everything, including your papers and the review process, will be recorded. And in the retrospective evaluation, we first proposed a common matching pipeline. We leveraged GPT-4 to first summarize the key comments from that has been provided in this feedback. And after doing this summarization, we asked GPT-4 to come up with a score, deciding on to what extent the feedback from either from AI or human, they match to each other. And based on that, we calculate a match point and overlap coefficient. And the specific reason that we first do this summarization is we do not just want to get some lower level like linguistic similarities between AI feedback and human feedback, but we really want to see if the two feedbacks, they get to the same key comments. And that's the primary goal of the summarization module. And using this pipeline, we first validated that and finding that through human verification that it is getting pretty good performance. And using this particular approach, we get the following findings. First, we find the large language model feedback is significantly overlaps with human-generated feedback or human peer review. We find that around 30% of comments raised by GPT-4 overlap with comments from an individual human reviewer. And just to put that into context, for the same paper, the overlap between one human versus another human reviewer for the same paper is also around 30%. So in other words, GPT-4 in some ways, it is at a high level acting as another human to this particular work in this review process. And we find similar patterns over the iClear data sets, where the overlap between AI versus human is similar to the extent a human has with another human. And such type of patterns, it also holds true when we break down by different fields. Another interesting thing that we find here is when we stratify by the decision outcome of iClear conferences on the papers, we find that the overlap between AI and human reviewers, it is actually larger for the rejected papers. We see that for the rejected papers, the overlap is much higher, indicating that large language model feedback could be particularly constructive and formative for papers that require more substantial revisions to be accepted. And arguably, those are the papers that would need more feedback. And another thing that we tested out in this particular work is we try to understand whether large language model, it could generate feedbacks that are specific to the paper. Despite showing previously that the overlap between AI and human is quite considerable, one could argue back that large language model is just generating things that could be applied to all the papers. Like, for example, this paper lacks novelty or needs to add more experiments, things like that. So we wonder if that's the case or not. So here we conduct a random shuffling exercise to see whether if that's the case or not. Basically, the idea is we have the null model, large language model mostly produce generic feedback that applies to many papers. If that's the case, if we shuffle the feedback that is provided to the paper from another paper, then we would expect to see there's no changing overlap if the feedback from AI is generic. However, after this shuffling, what we find is that we see significant decrease in overlap, indicating that the large language model feedback is actually paper specific. We also find that comments raised by multiple human reviewers, they are more likely to be hit by GPT-4. In other words, those aspects where human reviewers have some sort of consensus on. And finally, on this retrospective evaluation side, we find that GPT-4s and human, they do differ in topics. GPT-4 tends to focus on certain aspects of scientific feedback, like implications of research, or adding experiments on more data sets, as you could see on the right-hand figure, which is showing the frequency ratio between AI and human reviewer. Whereas on the other sides, human reviewer, they tend to talk a lot about the novelty of the paper, as well as things like missing citations. Due to the limitation of time, I'll go through this second study very, very quickly. So the second study, we sent out this particular tool to researchers from over 100 US institutes. And basically having them using this particular tool and answer some surveys on whether they think this particular tool is helpful or not. And the results largely correlates with what we find in study 1 in the retrospective evaluation. Overall, more than half of the users found GPT-4 generated feedback helpful or very helpful, and over 80% of them found it more beneficial than feedback from at least some human reviewers. And also further validating what we find from study 1, over 70% of participants think there is at least partial alignment between large language model feedback and what they think or what they actually get from significant points in issues with their papers from human reviewers. So just to put this work together, in this particular work, we built this particular tool and we evaluated its effectiveness. And it turns out that large language model, to a certain extent, could be helpful in giving feedback back to the authors of the paper. And I would like to emphasize here that while human expert feedback is and should continue to be the foundation of rigorous research process, we could think about incorporating LLM feedback in the research process, especially when timely expert feedback is not available or in earlier stage of manuscript preparations before peer review. And some ongoing works that we have been conducting is we are launching out randomized experiments, testing out the effects of this particular work in the wild. And with that, I would like to wrap up here. I don't think I have more time to go over, say, future work, but yeah, just to sum up, I've been very, very curious about this vision of trying to build towards a science of technologies. And in my case, I've been doing a number of works studying workplace technologies. And I really think that there's a lot of potential where computer science and social science joining force together in providing more empirical evidence, technical methods, as well as about thinking about designs to particular technologies, in addition to understanding mechanisms of human behavior and studying things which social scientists usually study. And I really believe that there could be lots of synergies here, and they're really looking forward to more discussions.
Thanks. So yeah, any questions at this moment? Thank you for Hancheng's talk so far, and yeah. So anyone from the audience want to ask some questions here? If not, I wonder for the last sorry, someone, yeah, you continue.
Oh, 那个 Dr. Chen, I'm curious about the viability paper.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you test this possibility because the linguistic characteristics are I think are related or linked to personal traits, personal characteristics, and
Right.
it's possible that someone is more I think more active in promoting this team collaboration atmosphere, and it always can bring this more team viability for any short-term project he or she is in.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure if I follow your question, but yes, definitely linguistic patterns differ from people to people. What we find here is indicating that the specific way, the specific linguistic style, it do have a number of associations with the outcomes of the team. So arguably one specific interventions people do, if people think more carefully about the way they interact with the team members, like if they say refer to each other more and talking about teams more and addressing each other in a more positive way, that could potentially lead the teams to have better collaboration experience. So that's one implication of that. And aside from that, we could also think about potential interventions like having automatic tools like AIs to monitor what has been going on in this kind of team collaboration and suggesting ways to reframe the messages people given to the others so that without loss of the content, trying to encourage and making each other feel that they are working a better way. So as such, I think like there could be lots of space where technologies could be helping in facilitating and promoting a positive collaboration experience.
Oh, thank you. So it's like an AI companion for teamwork, right?
Yes, that could be one way to think about it. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Frank, you can talk.
Oh,
Hi, Frank.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, Hancheng. Thanks for the talk. It is great stuff. I have two clarifying questions for the third study, the AI referee one. First, maybe I missed this in your talk, but do GPTs make the decisions of whether to accept or reject the paper?
Yes, that's a very, very good point. No, in our work, we didn't include that aspect of having GPT to decide whether the paper will get seen or not. And well, we didn't include that in the paper, but we have done a bunch of experiments out there. It just turns out that compared to the actual content overlap with human reviewers, that score given by GPT is actually very different from what human gives. And specifically, we find that GPT-4, they tends to be acting a very friendly way. Most of the time, they would consider the paper to be a paper that could be accepted. Perhaps they have been tuned ahead of time, during the process by OpenAI people, just to, making sure that the outputs are always framed in a positive way.
Right. So it's definitely not referee number 2. That's good news. My second question is, when I'm thinking about the implications of this, I find one of the findings quite interesting. That is, GPT and human, they have 30% of overlap, and human and human, they have 30% of overlap. So if you use human by adding one more human, then you have more information, more points being covered. But if you have one AI and then add another AI and then add another AI, do you see AI and AI to be, only 30% the same and adding a lot more points? So if
Yes.
not, okay. So
Well,
if you have multiple AI, they have different
yes,
key points.
this is a great point. We have a version of where we have multiple AIs, AI reviewers for the same paper. And essentially, we didn't include that in this particular paper, but what we did out there is that we have GPT-4 to role play reviewers or humans coming from different expertise or different background. So for example, especially for those interdisciplinary paper, we first asked AI to decide what are some relevant views to this paper. So for example, if it's a computational biology paper, then relevant background could be biology, computer science, statistics, and some other fields. So basically, we have AI first to decide what are some fields that are relevant to this particular work. And then we ask AI to role play those different people, different human reviewers. So we have one bot that is acting as the computer scientist reviewing this particular paper. And another person is acting as a biologist reviewing for this particular paper. And they are raising points that, there are some overlaps. We didn't do like a very systematic analysis out there, but with more reviewers introduced out there, from 1 to 4 in that particular case, we do see that the number of key points raised out there is increasing. But on the other hand, if you have GPT-4 to give, say, 20 reviewers or even more reviewers, then at certain point it's saturating. It's not going to provide, say, many points to that particular paper, since I think there's an upper bound that AI is able to give for that particular work.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Hancheng. So my question for the last paper is, there are some opinions that the large language models don't really have logic or predictability. So I wonder whether that will affect its judgment on the creativity of the papers. So I could imagine for human experts, right? They know the field quite well, and they have a vision, right? They can expect, or they can kind of sense what will be the next breakthrough or development, right, of the literature of the whole field. And especially even for computer science, I guess there is a time lag between published paper or public working papers and the published there's a lag of working paper to publish, right? So I wonder if the large language models could only study from the public sources, whether it is missing the most frontier, work in progress part compared to the experts, human experts. So I wonder whether that will make it less likely to judge the creativity, less able to judge the creativity of the papers.
Yes, that's a great point. I guess there are a couple of points that I would like to I like to discuss a bit here. So first, I think I agree with you. large language model definitely is not at the same quality level as an actual expert reviewer who is willing to spend time on that particular work. The quality it's generating is definitely not as good as someone who is, really dedicated to that review process. So from an application point of view, what I was thinking that could be helpful is large language model give feedbacks for, those papers who are, say clearly off the bar, or like, as mentioned earlier, from, people who lack feedback or lack supervision. I think those people could be benefiting from those, roll round of large language model feedback in getting their paper into better shapes, or fixing some problems that are clearly off, to have the paper accepted at a particular place. But if we are really judging a paper on very, very important dimensions, like say novelty, creativity, and even methods, rigor, I think it's still at this point, human is super, super important to be part of that process. And that's why that we're seeing this more of a kind of like a feedback tool rather than to say substitute human reviews. And the second point that I want to raise here, that it's not included in our paper, but another point that I want to raise is AI is advancing pretty fast. So we did this version when GPT-4 just came out, and we get this particular result. And we also played with, say, later versions, more recent versions of GPT-4, like GPT-4 OS, O1, and one big advance that I think O1 especially have is that the reasoning capability is gaining much better compared to GPT-4. And nowadays, GPT-4 is also able to do like search related actions, not just doing things based on the knowledge base it is trained on. So that is helping making the feedback looking better and having better performance compared to previous versions of the model. So that's the other point that I want to raise. But in general, I don't think for judging the key contributions of the paper, or even deciding whether the paper should get in a particular outlets or not, it should be like replaced by AI. I don't think that's a goal that we should try to achieve. But moreover, it's given this option of generative AI, how can we present that to the end users so that more people could be benefiting from that without introducing additional labor on human side.
Yeah, got you. Yeah, so are there any questions from the audience now?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Cao, and also interesting in your third study, you have talked about how you use the model. But my question is, finding a good prompt to make the AI make this review is also very important and hard. And finding a good I think is a very key questions in your paper. So how did you find a good enough prompt to do this review?
That's a great point. Prompt engineering is always quite important in such type of work. So in our particular case, we did spend quite some time trying to figure out a prompt that could produce better results. And we find that it is helpful to have, say, some guidelines for journals or for conferences, which we actually incorporate as part of the prompt. And aside from that, the other things, we didn't really spend additional things aside from introducing those review criteria from the actual conferences and journals. The major consideration out there is back then we actually did not really have an idea whether the feedback is good or not. So we basically want to get a lower bound its performance. And so throughout this particular study, we are finding that it is actually getting something out there. And the things that we haven't yet tried, but we think promising on that end is first introducing some sides of fine-tuning process where you gather some high-quality reviews and papers and having GPT to learn like what a good and helpful review look like, and using that to as some sorts of supervision to make this model perform better. Another thing that could be involving in this process that we didn't do, including things like you could actually have the AI to use some external tools to judge this particular paper. So for example, there could be some tools to check, say, mathematical rigor, if there's some proof in this paper, or introducing some tools to specifically looking for related works or literatures in that space, which their shot GPT itself are not capable or are not super good at. So I think there are such types of elements that could potentially be adding and strengthening this particular tool. But again, in this particular work, since it is kind of like a proof of concept per study, we didn't really include that part and just use the carefully designed prompts at testing whether it is working well or not.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. So in the interest of time, I guess if we don't have further questions, we'll call the end of today here. And yeah, thank you for Hancheng for generously sharing your research and your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks everyone for being here.